This is for you.
Thank you.
And this is for Dr. Yates. Just in
Okay,
case
here
you
she
should-
comes.
Rahmat? A second.
So if you want to give you a 5-minute hand up, right? I'll just let you know when you have 5 minutes left.
Okay. Thank you. I want to start by dedicating this work to the minority groups in the Niger Delta of Nigeria and to the millions who lost their lives in the struggle for self-determination and resource equity in Africa and the world. Dr. Uchi Anam and Dr. Ambassador Einig, invited guests, fellow students, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of my thesis presentation today is multinational oil companies, government, and the incessant rise of militancy, what I call the Niger Delta dilemma. The outline of my presentation today will be as such. I will commence by providing a general overview of Nigeria, followed
We
by...
just got, sorry. Keep going.
Followed by applied theories, statement of the problem, timeline of the Niger Delta conflict, presentation of CASCOM factors and analysis, conclusion, and recommendations. A single case study by Robert Yin is what this research employs as method, and a qualitative field research used to inform responses to 30 of CASCOM 571 conflict factors, all of which were extracted to be exclusively used in analyzing the conflict case of the Niger Delta. CASCOM, however, is a conflict computer-aided system designed for the purpose of making conflict analysis. This research then begs the question, is the Niger Delta conflict influenced by factors of ethnicity, which looks at identity contest and self-determination, natural resource, the contest for oil autonomy, and militancy as a result of multinational oil companies and government actions and activities within the oil region of Nigeria, the Niger Delta? For hypothesis, I will argue the affirmative, that indeed the three factors on the review are present and are vastly influencing the conflict. Shall we proceed? Nigeria is located in sub-Saharan Africa and is a member state of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. Its population is estimated to be between 180 to 200 million. Nigeria has the largest and fastest growing economy in Africa, number one, in crude oil export, accounting for over 80% of government's revenue. Nigeria typifies with resource theorist Rick Orty described the resource curse, or World Bank economist Paul Collier, greed versus grievance, in reference to the Niger Delta conflict. It is also symbolic of what Iranian economist Madawi described a rentier state to mean countries that depend on a substantial amount of rents from exports for economic survival. Nigeria is home to the Niger Delta, and the Niger Delta is home to the country's oil wealth, and oil, as we've just been informed, is the fulcrum of the country's economic sustainability. But despite the plentiness of oil, the region is plagued with many developmental contradictions. The criminalization of Nigeria's oil is coordinated through a corrupt system of multinational oil companies, government officials, state institutions, and militants who continue to push the conflict away from a peaceful resolution. But in order to understand Nigeria today and the conflict of the Niger Delta, it is imperative for us to go back to the colonial history of the country so as to put into context the three factors that are being examined in this research. Beginning in 1914, the year of Nigeria's amalgamation, and what is generally considered the catalyst of the current ethno-political problems in the country. May I proceed? In 1914, British colonists merged together over 400 distinct ethnic groups. Soon following the amalgamation of Nigeria, ethnic contests for land, boundaries, and political autonomy began. The emergence of self-determination in national groups also started, which led to the establishment of the Willing Commission in 1955-56. In 1954, the Nigerian Federation was established, which brought to prominence the three major ethnic groups in the country: the Hausa Fulani from the north, the Yorubas from the west, and the Igbos from the east. Ethnic disputes from the colonial time were left unsettled, and independence was gained in 1960. Although oil was discovered in 1956, although oil was discovered in 1956, the fiscal leech of Nigeria during the colonial period depended on exports from the south of Nigeria, which is the Niger Delta. Commercial exploitation of oil in Nigeria began in 1958, at which time the allocation formula for revenue stood at a 50-30-20% ratio, where states producing oil received 50%, 30% was placed into what was called a distributable pool account, and 20% was given to the central government of Nigeria. Currently, there's been an enormous decrease in the distribution of oil revenues, which stands at a modicum 13% today. Now, following independence, there were some measures that were taken, some legislations that were passed to dispossess minorities of their rights to land and the resources on their land, amongst which were the Petroleum Decree 51 Act of 1969, the Land Use Act Decree 6 of 1978, and the Mining Act of 1999. Militancy as a factor. The inception of militancy in the Niger Delta goes back to the 1966 Isaac Burroughs Revolution, where he declared, Nottingham Dick and Samuel Owonaroa declared the independence of the Niger Delta. A new group of advocates emerged in the 1990s, Ken Saro-Wiwa, with the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, USAP, which also accelerated to the rise of militant groups in 2000, the Niger Delta Vigilantes, the Niger Delta People Vigilante Force, Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, etc., etc. In 2009, the government of Nigeria granted amnesty to the militants. So over 30,000 militants turned in their arms, and they were given some sort of economical way to carry on their lives, support to carry on their lives. So I have strategically picked out 30 questions from the CASCON system to fit my factors that I've been working on. And these are my questions that you're looking at, but because of time, I will not be able to go through the 30 questions. I will only present two for each factors. So question 5.3, which looks at ethnicity. It asks, has there been an armed struggle in the region by minority groups? And the answer is yes. And here I make reference to the 12 Days Revolution by Isaac Burroughs, Nottingham Dick, and Samuel Owonaroa. Samuel Owonaroa here happens to be the only survivor of the three men who led the revolution, and he currently lives in Bayelsa State, Kayama District. So it was a conflict between the Niger Delta Vigilante Force and the federal military government. After 12 days, the government regained control of the Niger Delta. Question 5.8. Two sides are historic enemies. Here I want to strike something very important. Although the groups that are currently fighting for oil autonomy in the Niger Delta are considered or relegated to minority status, it's also important to note that the Igbos themselves have also been involved in a struggle for self-determination. And here I want to make reference to the Biafra conflict of 1967 to 1970, which is also considered the Nigerian Civil War. But here these are, in 1945, the East and North was involved into a dispute. The Igbos contested its national identity status against the Hausa group. So as you can see, there's been an old conflict, an old ethnic conflict between Hausa group and minority groups in the Niger Delta, and the three major groups that I mentioned earlier, the Hausa, the Fulani, and the Igbos. Question 5.20. Is resource region ruined by exploration activities? This question here focuses on oil companies and their operations in the Niger Delta, which has also given a push to militancy within the Niger Delta. So companies like Shell has been operating in Nigeria since 1937, but they struck oil in 1956. But since they started exploring for oil, there's been issues with oil spillage, bunkering, and all of that, which have contaminated the waterways of the communities that the people live in, and have also killed the fish in the water, and et cetera, et cetera. So here you see the highest amount of oil spillage is in 1979, and it's 570,000 barrels. And here you can see evidence of what that oil spillage looks like in the Niger Delta. So these are local communities within the Niger Delta, and these are oil spillage products here that you're looking at. Question 5.18. Economic policies of status quo side exploitative. The answer is yes. The colonial oil and mineral laws of 1887, 1907, and 1914, which were amended in 1925, 1950, and 1958 respectively, gave oversight responsibility and oil monopoly to colonial administration and British oil companies in Nigeria. Also, the Petroleum Decree Act, which I mentioned earlier, the Land Use Act, and the Mining Act, those are also economic policies that continue to keep the minority groups at bay and not get the substantial amount of the revenues that they should be getting from the oil. Since 1969, you here can see the ebb and flow in the distribution for producing states. So it went from 50% to 45% offshore, 20%. In 1989, they received no revenue at all, and then when the loss was 1.5%. Currently, it's at 13%. This is what oil producing states are receiving in Nigeria. Question 5.2. This disputed area threatening stability and security of the region. The threats to human and national security range from the menace of separatist demands, illegal militia armies, ethnic and religious conflicts, terrorism, armed robbery, corruption, and poverty to sabotage of public properties, economic sabotage, and environmental degradation. Among these, ethno-religious fighting and violent attacks in the oil-rich Niger Delta form the major security challenges, security dilemma. The predominant threats and security challenges in the area are emanating from unabating attacks on oil installations, arms proliferation, sea piracy, youth restlessness, bunkering, kidnap, and hostage taking. Question 5.23. A military resistance had been organized to quell uprising in the resource region. The answer is also yes. Apologies, I just forgot to indicate that. But the answer is yes. And here I show a list of military operations that the Nigerian military government and constitutional government has carried out against minority groups within the region. So here in 1991, the Omichin massacre, which happened in Bayelsa State. In 1998, the killing following the Kayama Declaration. So in 1998, the Kayama Declaration was signed by Kayama youth, and they also presented their plights to the Nigerian government, demanding what they want done in the Niger Delta. In 2000, sorry, let me go back. Okay, in 2000, the destruction of Odi. So here I'm here with the king of Odi. Odi was one of the districts, one of the districts in Bayelsa State that was completely wiped out by President Obasanjo in 2000. In 2009, the destruction of Agi and Baramatu Kingdom as well. Conclusion. The presence of ethnic underpinnings in the Niger Delta conflict is key to this analysis. Cultural characteristics and interests that are subjectively considered for ethnic group mobilization are often focused on mutual protest, for cultural recognition and respect, economic opportunity, land and resource autonomy, inclusion, equity, and statehood. However, the escalation of the conflict can be attributed to the emergence of petroleum as the fiscal basis of the Nigerian state, that status of petroleum as a critical element in the reproduction of the ruling class, and the ultimate price of the political power. When it is considered that the bulk of the oil is extracted from the lands and waters of the Niger Delta, it is not difficult to explain why the continued marginalization of oil minorities of the Delta from the centers of economic and political power has explained why power has now become a volatile issue in Nigerian politics. Militancy then becomes a rule, not an exception. It is considered poor scholarship to posit what-ifs as a true premise for logical reasoning, but as a counterfactual case, what if the Northern Hausa region in Nigeria was oil-rich? Would the situation be any different than it is today in the Niger Delta? my recommendations. So I have short-term recommendations and long-term recommendations. For short-term recommendations, I recommend that equitable revenue distribution of oil-producing states. The barest minimum of 40% revenue allocation for oil-producing states in Nigeria. Fiscal federalism as well should be granted to states, where they will be able to control their own finances and revenues from oil production. Demilitarization of the oil region. Currently, and for a very long time, the Niger Delta has been militarized. It is a militarized zone. Develop a reformed and pragmatic economic policy as a code of conduct for multinational oil companies' operations in the Niger Delta. The same policy should prioritize and address, within the shortest time possible, issues relating to youth unemployment and the peripheral social dangers of the region. Long-term recommendations. I recommend a cleanup of polluted oil communities within the Niger Delta, infrastructural roads, schools, hospitals, electricity, safe drinking water, and development projects in the Niger Delta. Thank you very much. I will now stop here to entertain questions, comments, and corrections. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Do you want me to continue?
You preside, that's it, I take notes.
All right, so.
Let me just first, I'd like to apologize for everyone. I had this written down for 12 o'clock, so I thought I was coming in early to help Robert set up, and it ends up I walk in the door and I'm running late, so my apologies to everyone for that.
Oh, okay. We were all worried.
Yeah, I didn't have my phone on me either, apparently.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Robert, for an excellent presentation. What I'm going to do is I let Ambassador Einik ask questions and make comments first.
Okay.
I guess I'll go second, and then I will let your advisor, Professor Douglas Yates, go last in defense of and with some more questions on your paper. Ambassador.
Robert, thank you very much. I found this quite refreshing, I have to say, as an overall paper. I think your summary at the end to sort of define the problem was quite well done. Recommendations, I mean, it's sort of like, I wish I could win the lottery as well. I mean, they're the obvious things to do, but they should have been done years ago. But given the fact that I've lived in Nigeria and I've lived in the Balkans, I've got to question your use of the concept of Balkanization. If I remember correctly, on page 26, page 71, and page 79, in the first two cases, you relate to the Balkanization of Nigeria, and then in the last case, if I remember correctly, to the Balkanization of Africa.
You said page 7?
Page 26. Yes, and the copy I have. Yeah. The copy I have.
Prior to the
Yeah,
balkanization.
prior to the Balkanization of Africa.
24?
26.
It's right after your CASCON table.
Yes. The third line down.
Start the paragraph, the pervading notion.
Okay.
Prior to the Balkanization of Africa.
Yeah.
And then on page 71, you comment on, consequently, the Balkanization, conquering of the continent in 1800 to the 1900s.
71?
71. I have to ask you to kind of, and then on 79, 71, the second paragraph.
Second paragraph.
About line 4. '71.
Yes, this is 71.
Because I don't have that 71. Here, Robert. This right here. Why don't you look at mine? Oh, you have a different numeration.
Because I gave you the updated.
Yeah, I know. You just gave me that, but I was working from this one.
Oh, so the may have been changed because
Yeah, I'm
the numbers
sorry.
are flipped.
So it's section 5.6.
Okay. Okay. Traditional kingdoms and members.
And then down here, Balkanizations.
Right, the Balkans. Okay.
And then on page 79, you use it again. And I have to say, I'd like you to try to convince me that this is the right phraseology. Again, 5.12, the third line down.
Yeah.
5.2,
5.2, okay.
5.12, I'm sorry, Robert. My fault.
Okay, all right. 5.12.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
And then sort of the third line, you talk about colonial rulers balkanized the country more than they did to keep it together.
So third line?
Third line down
Mhm.
to 512.
Besides a known fact.
Yeah.
Here?
Yeah. Okay. Help me understand the use of balkanization in this context, okay?
Well, except that it was a misuse of phraseology, but the balkanization, what I mean by the balkanization of Africa is more just like the scramble for Africa that sort of broke
Okay.
Africa into parts.
Okay. See, in my mind, I see it as the reverse. I mean,
Mm.
balkanization really derived from the breakup of Yugoslavia, when you had a federal state and it was broken into its pieces. In my mind, and maybe it's because I'm dyslexic, I see Africa as the opposite, where the colonial powers took smaller states or kingdoms and put them together, not broke them apart.
Mhm.
You see? So in my mind, I mean, scramble for Africa is a known phrase.
Yeah, I was trying not to use.
I know, but it's
Cliche one.
probably a cliche.
Yeah.
But I would take another look at the use of balkanization in this context, because the general usage of the word is when a federal something is broken into pieces. And I have difficulty seeing that in the context of Africa. I know you were trying to look for a different word to use, but there's another issue that there was the discussion of cultural and social issues, and I think the question was does one of the combatants see themselves as culturally superior to the others? And I don't remember the number
There
of
was
them.
the cultural groups, not
Right.
the combatants.
Okay, the cultural groups.
Yes.
And you don't
Ethnic groups.
really address that. I mean, you never say, for example, the Hausa Fulani see themselves as superior to the Igbos, or the Igbos see themselves as superior to the Hausa Fulani. I mean, you discuss it, but you never really come to a conclusion that one of the groups feels superior to the other. Maybe they don't, but I would have to think one of them does.
Yeah.
Number 5.9,
Yeah.
one group side
Yeah.
considers itself culturally superior.
And I don't think you come to a conclusion there. You discuss it, but you don't really state that there is this sense of superiority by one group over another. And the last question is just for my clarification, Robert. When you talk about minority groups in this context, you don't mean the Igbos.
No.
That's right. I just want to make sure now, right? So what you're saying is you want to devolve this oil income not to the Igbos who control the region, but to the groups below them, in fact.
Right.
And I'm not sure how that would happen in the context of the states really being controlled by the largest group in the region. So can you just sort of talk
And
me
that's
through
why,
that?
and that's why at the very first page of my work, I said the Niger Delta dilemma, because
Right.
that's exactly
Right.
what some of these issues entail. So now, the Biafras or the Igbos themselves are within the region of the Niger Delta,
Right.
and they too have been fighting, they've been having self-determination
Right.
protests to break away from Nigeria, and I made a specific reference to
Right.
the Nigerian Civil War, 1967 to 1970. So in a sense, I would say that based on the colonial structure that sort of gave prominence to the Hausa Fulani group in the country, They are seen as the ones who ban because they have the highest numbers of population in the country. They have that sort of control or dominance over the other groups, and that is why the other groups who are of majority status have also been contesting to secure their nationality or their independence as well. So the Ijaws, they've also been involved, just like the Igbo has as well.
Okay. Just one last question. You mentioned 6 geopolitical zones. I'm assuming the Niger Delta is the south-south zone?
South-south, yes,
Okay.
it is.
So you don't make that real, you don't say that specifically. Okay. Thank you. That's all for me.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Okay, great. I guess I'll take the floor. I'll go next. Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on an excellent presentation and very fancy PowerPoints,
Yeah.
which was a very welcome change from your mock defense that I saw not very long ago. So I can tell you I was impressed partly because the first show was not that great. So well done on that. So without much delay, I'm just going to get cracking on my comments. So some are just really, stuff in the thesis. Like for instance, after your footnotes, all of your footnotes, you have like a page number, but you don't have a period going. So literally clean that up throughout the thesis. There isn't a period to end that. I strongly recommend that you put titles for your chapters in your table, but also for instance, you have chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Like, I think you could come up with something more interesting. You can do Chapter 1, Introduction, Chapter 2, Literature Review, Chapter 3, Methodology, etc. So, and then there's some stuff which I'll give you my marked up copy, but I want to jump straight to my favorite part, which is theory. And so I see that there's no chapter at all on theory. There's a literature review that deals with resource curse, rentier's trade, green grievances, etc. So you touch upon that. But I found that particularly stunning that you hadn't sort of had a section on theory when you have that nice chart going, because from that theoretical premise, I'm guessing you would explain how you move from that list of variables or factors that you have in the Cascon software to the 3 that you select. I didn't quite see that link. Like, why do you pick those 3? Why do you pick ethnicity, natural resources, and militancy, and get rid of external relations, international organizations, internal politics, community? So I think there is some sort of justification there that is, I can understand, inherent in the theory, but because there isn't that section at all, I recommend strongly adding that part, because you jump straight from literature review to Cascon to methodology to, voila, I've shown what I wanted to. But I think if you were to just have an added section that deals with theory, and then you explain how you could possibly maybe prioritize which ones you think are most important from the literature, and then get into, here's my reasoning for selecting those 3, on which then further your entire methodology seems to, you see what I mean? So I want you to talk a little bit about that, because I think the rest of my comments are also all related. So here I'm talking about page 7, where you have your 3 selected factors. Okay, I'll write it for you. I'm sure Douglas is going to take the notes. Then page 25, where you have the entire table for 3.1. So the transition from that table to the 3 that you select. Further down, page 28, where you have an entire table with your factors and the questions. And I thought it would also be in your interest to maybe break down those questions into the 3 chunks, the 3 factors that you pick. You see, they all just appear in a list, but it could be, I think, much more intelligible to sort of break those down into 3 and then link it back to, well, here's my theory, here are the 3 factors I picked, here's how my protocol questions are divided up using those theoretical assumptions. And then, all right, that. So why do you choose the factors? What are the possible... So on that table where you have that list of protocol questions, you have your questions and you have the sources where you're getting the answers to those questions from, right? Which is good. But the part that I thought was missing and you could add there is, what are the possible answers there? And what do those answers mean? How will those add up for you to say, yeah, in fact, there is an issue? And then even within these three factors, I'm guessing there's some sort of hierarchy that you could place. There's some sort of analysis you could do about, you see, if you could break those down into the three: ethnicity, militancy, and natural resources. And then you say, all right, here's what the answers likely would look like. And then here's what the answers would mean, which you then add up to give your conclusions. Right? So that part was, I thought, missing, and it would really strengthen your thesis. I would add a table at some point where you would have all the answers written out, like a summary table, you know, at the end of your case study chapter.
The case study you could answer them.
Where you have these questions with the potential answers and the answers that you found. All right? Does ethnic group have power than the other? Yes. So you write all those, yes, no, and then it'll be a nice little chart summarizing the answers, which will allow you in those three categories to be able to then further your conclusions.
That would go well.
I think that would go really well. And for me, all of that really starts from a nice little chunk, I'd say chapter, but if you don't want to do a chapter, at least the end of your literature review should be devoted to theories, your choice of theories, the three that you pick, and then how your entire methodology is tailored based on those, which would allow you to read out the rest of the factors that are there in the Cascon software. It would explain your choice of the 30 questions out of the many that were available, all right? And then you move on from there. So I think that links to theory, method, so that those would be my main comments there. Like Ambassador Einig, I did like your conclusions. Here I'm talking page 111, 112 in your thesis, but I felt like most of you all, students that I've seen here in the many years, your conclusion is usually like, I'm done with my thesis, let me write 4 pages and I'm done. I think you could do slightly better on that chapter, really sort of chewing through what you've done, asking further questions for research, pointing out certain limitations of what you did, and then your policy recommendations and summary, I thought was, I hate to say that, but by far your weakest part of the thesis, because it was fluff, you would agree. Like there's no concrete, here's what that can be done. For instance, you go, in order to remedy the conflict, the best way to achieve it requires active national engagement and steadfast commitment to dealing with the challenges and grievances facing the region. The Nigerian government must reorganize its policy toolkit, form and implement positive policy measures, whatever those are, towards the oil. So I think it would be nice to have Robert, the policy analyst, if you have to take that on, giving very realistic sort of solutions, if not solutions for the conflict, which like we're all saying, you know, it's been going on forever and obviously solutions are not that simple. Deal with the intricacies of it, deal with the complexities of it, and maybe at that point, one of the limitations might just be that table where you have a host of factors that you didn't deal with, and explain how, you know, if you were to pick any one specific aspect of the problem, what would you likely recommend as realistic policy solutions? Down the road you go, you know, another one of your suggestions is develop a reformed and pragmatic economic policy as a code of conduct for multinationals. That's a huge demand you're making, just because, you know, all that multinational issue is not even in the 3 factors that you pick. So I think without getting too fancy at the end, you would be very well off really just summarizing what you did and then pulling from that into some realistic solutions. Yeah, I think it could, and then I think a bibliography needs to be single space, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's just logistical stuff. But overall, I thoroughly enjoyed reading it for the manner in which you kind of built through it. There was just that one chunk, which is my area of work, theories. I'm just like, wait a minute, how did you go from lit review to Cascon? Like, that's your fault. But
that's why with the third person, usually the advisor then responds, and I'll have my mea culpa for that because we're.
All right, so now I'll pass the floor on to your advisor, Professor Yates, who can.
Well, you're
Did you
also
want to respond to
presiding, yeah.
any of my points? I mean, mainly theory,
Yeah, I took notes of your.
and you're in agreement with.
Certainly.
Okay, great. You don't have a choice, right?
Okay, so, yeah, I would agree that balkanization, with what you were saying, that wasn't at all, you had it backwards, I think, and I think he as well sees that. So for balkanization, it is the opposite, it's federation rather than balkanization. So those are removed, and I'm glad you had the specific pages. I was in the scramble taking notes to navigate through the document, because the document gets larger and sometimes gets hard to find the things. Plus there appears to be a new draft that you were working with, so the pages were different. So I've marked the page numbers on the draft that I have, that will do it on there. But yeah, so balkanization. So sometimes there would be terminology. I feel that as a writer, you're often making an effort to not use conventional or ordinary words. And towards the end of the editing process, I decided to leave those kinds of elements because it gave an authenticity. It was clearly your document. So I thought I was a harsh editor with you, but towards the end, as we had more of a relationship going, I could recognize when you were at a stylistic consideration. One of your stylistic features is to use very large and sometimes exotic words. Yes. I did, however, learn a word from you that now I've incorporated into my vocabulary, which is pelf. And
you're welcome. I had to look that one up myself.
Yeah, I like that. I'm going to use pelf. I don't know where, but I've lots of opportunities. So, and that's part, I think, of your style. Right. The danger always of the style is that not that people don't understand the word, but simply that the word sometimes will have a different meaning or different connotation. So balkanization, I would have to agree. For the theories chapter, I think this is a very good thing to do. And as the years have gone on, we've been through repeated rounds, and I'll often have the students simply put their theory into the literature review. Sometimes that works, but here I think it wasn't clear how the vast literature of resource you ended up selecting these three factors. So in kind of taking your side in that literature review, it might be nice to extract them from the literature and insert, before you get to the method, how you chose these ones over the others. You kind of took a side in the debate, and then to, which might even involve rearranging the order if you do, grouping these into three drawers that correspond to the theory. So I, once again, that's a mea culpa for me, and I'll often do this, and I'm going to try to do it less and less in the future, but often I'll have the students just put their theory in the literature review, and that created that problem. So that wasn't his fault, that was my fault as the advisor on there. Yeah, so we went through a last draft working on the footnotes, and the period at the end does belong there. But if you could only see how far we've come with Chicago manual style, and and his heavily marked up copy of Kate Turabian's, you would be proud. So one of the someone as his advisor, one of the things I would really compliment you on is getting a mastery of the style book that will serve you the rest of your life. It's not the only style book, but it's so widespread, used by so many institutions in so many places. And then once you have one style, then it's very easy to simply shift. Like if you get your driver's license in America, then you have to go to England, they drive on the wrong side of the road. But it's easy to proceed getting a driver's license once you've gone through the whole thing. So I thought that for citing your sources, it was really one of the areas where you'll leave here and you know what the rules are. You'll probably find yourself correcting other people. That's the story of everyone in this game. You start off on the receiving end and you end up on the other end, and you'll be exasperated at someone who's not citing.
Does the page number have to have Clark before every... I know it's nice to see your name on every page, but I think you could really just put a page...
referring to the stylistic...
I've left stylistic.
That's original too, I haven't seen that before.
Yeah.
I didn't see anything that prohibited it. So
okay. Yeah, likewise.
So Chicago manual style apparently does leave you free to do that.
All right, we'll leave it.
And things like the double numeration system and the rest, there was a lot of work made to have this conform to the Chicago Manual of Style. There's a lot of work, and I could feel that constraint on you. But I think as a writer, that constraint will allow you to enjoy your freedom differently, because I think your natural position is writing is freedom. And so all of these constraints and binds will give a structure to your style that was different from when you arrived. And I know that, you know, as soon as you write the next thing, you're going to completely get unchained and throw all of this stuff off. And I'm expecting stream of consciousness or something, probably for a period of months after the thesis in reaction. But I felt that you really structured it. And that was, of course, the quality that I most look for. That your case study, particularly the empirical section, was broken into lots of small units, so that we could deal with each separate issue separately. On one final matter, because there was one thing where I had raised something towards the end and we were dealing with final drafts, and I hadn't really had a chance to talk with you because you were producing a lot for the document. But when dealing with the sides of the conflict, I made one recommendation. I didn't have a chance to hear what you thought about it, because, you know, this is your opportunity. And I'm not, as your advisor, I'm not here, I'm not the prosecution, right? So that's not my role. But when you're talking about the sides of the conflict, I recommended considering just the status quo side to be the government, whoever that happened to be, whichever ethnic group that was, and the non-status quo side to be rebels, which sometimes could be northerners like Boko Haram, and sometimes could be southerners like the Ijaw. Did you feel that made sense as a way of pulling it together?
With the definition that CASCON provides, it does make sense.
Yeah, because CASCON forces you to choose, to break every conflict into two sides, which can be very difficult when conflicts have more than two sides. You have a status quo side. And then when you had Nigeria, where you have so many different conflicts. Yeah, that was
I'm a little troubled by that, because you have, in my mind, Nigeria is the federal government of Nigeria.
Yeah.
That would be status quo.
Then you have, if I understand correctly, then you have sort of the leading group in the Delta area, which is the Igbo, and then you have the minority groups below them. So in a sense, you have the conflict three-way almost.
That's right. So it's very difficult. One way to solve this with CASCON is to break it up into multiple conflicts. We did that with the thesis on the Undemocratic Republic of Congo, which is like, you know, Africa's world war, and you have a dozen different things, and so you just do like Eastern Democratic. And here it might have even been possible, but in the end I thought this offered one solution, just to say central government versus the rest. And I hadn't had a chance to talk to you about that. Yeah, so for the conclusion and policy recommendations, I know that, for example, say 40% of the states was your policy, but as you know, the states in Nigeria are very corrupt, and many of the people living in the states complain that precisely the state governors take everything for themselves. Is there a way of maybe directly distributing oil revenue? That's one of the recommendations.
So one of the things that the minority groups have been advocating for, and still is advocating for, it's restructuring. So when
distribution.
Yeah, restructuring. When that happens, states, oil producing states, will now be paying taxes to the federal government instead of them, you know, having a hold of the bounty. Yes, so
right, to change the distribution. Yeah, because some people have argued that direct distribution, even of smaller percentages, would have a much bigger kickoff effect.
And that's why I recommend 40%, because we know it's going to be impossible for them to return to status quo, where states will get 50% of the revenues. So to cut them a slightly, you know, I propose a 40% at least, but it's going to be a tough fight to get that done.
And thank you for putting the photos in. I did feel that, particularly, I guess, for people who hadn't read the document, you wouldn't have known that you did field research. And so I thought that was smart to get those in to show that this involved last summer you did field research. And field research really revolutionizes what, you know, you're writing about, what you think of a place. And I know when you came back, that was when you were ready to go, and you basically started writing in September, as soon as you came back from the field research. And something like this, you know, is evidence. You know, it's exactly, that's data. You know, it's very effective.
Okay, just taking from what you said, I mean, in the recommendations, it might be useful to see some of these different options, even without picking one, but looking at how there may be a way to redistribute. I mean, guaranteed minimum incomes, for example. I mean, some of the Mideast oil producers actually give individual inhabitants in the country a minimum income.
That would fight a lot of this bunkering,
You
you know,
know,
because people
so-
have some
right.
alternatives.
So
you know.
I think in the recommendation, because this is an insolvable problem, you're not going to be able to make a recommendation that's going to solve this, but addressing some of these different issues in that might be more intellectually interesting, I think.
Yeah, that would go well, actually, in the conclusion sections, I think.
Yeah.
Great.
You're
Well,
the president.
thank you very much, Robert, and the audience. We're going to deliberate on your presentation and your new thesis. So if you want to step out, don't go too far with the audience, and we'll call you back in with the decision. Thank you.
I have to take note from what